and welcome to the first episode of the Google Ads API Developer Series on working with REST. I'm Laura Chevalier, and I'm a Developer Relations Engineer on the Google Ads API. In this series, we'll build our understanding on the different ways you can make use of REST to interact with the Google Ads API. We'll start with an introduction to the Google Ads REST API, which will establish a base of knowledge that we'll build upon in later episodes. First off, it's important to note that there are two different means of accessing the Google Ads API. REST is one of them, and the other is gRPC. These two transport methods access the same exact backend, but they also have some important differences I want to highlight before we get into the ins and outs of REST. With gRPC, we tend to have a smaller payload size, which makes it the more efficient transport method between the two. We also have type safety enforced both on the client side and the server side. Lastly, gRPC is provided out of the box when using the client libraries. This is a huge benefit because in addition to abstracting away the technicalities of gRPC, the client libraries provide lots of helper functions and take care of many of the low-level details like timeouts, pagination, and authentication. With REST by itself, we don't get the data type safety we got with gRPC. And for the most part, REST is not supported out of the box when using the client libraries, though I'll note that a couple of our client libraries do use REST under the hood. One benefit of using REST is that it's easy to use ad hoc with tools like curl and Postman. Having said all of that, we do recommend using client libraries wherever possible. There's an abundance of examples and utilities at your disposal when using any of our client libraries, and the efficiency and type safety of gRPC makes them a great choice for scalable applications. Still, you may find that REST is preferable for your API integration, or you may be interested in learning more about REST for your own command line debugging purposes. This series is here to help you understand how to work with REST, whatever the use case may be. In order to access the API using REST, we need to first prepare OAuth 2 credentials. That is, we need a client ID, client secret, refresh token, and access token. I'll go into more detail on authorization with REST in a later episode, but you can also check out our developer series on authentication, linked in the video description, for a better understanding on how to set up and make use of OAuth credentials for API access. Note that OAuth credentials are needed regardless of how you access the API. Besides our OAuth credentials, we'll also need a developer token and optionally a login customer ID to indicate the Google Ads customer ID of the manager making the API call. Now I want to get into some of the details of how the REST API is designed to help establish a base understanding for working with the REST API. The Google Ads API generally follows a resource-oriented design, which means that it's organized as collections of resources which are individually addressable. Each has a unique identifier and can be accessed using that identifier. For the Google Ads API, this design looks like a hierarchy of resources, where customers is the root node. Within customers, there are sub-resources like ad group ads and assets, among many others. There are some other resources at that root level, mainly constant resources like geo-target constants and language constants, but these don't have any sub-resources in the same way that customers does. These resources can easily be found in the Google Ads API reference documentation. The other aspect of resource-oriented design are the methods, which differ from resource to resource. Note that there are some methods which are found on multiple resources, but these methods can also be pretty custom across resources, which may be different from what you're familiar with if you've worked with more traditional REST method patterns. For example, if we look at the customers.recommendations resource, we have a couple of methods that we don't see in many other places, apply and dismiss, which makes sense because you want to either apply or dismiss a specific recommendation. So definitely make sure to check out that reference documentation to know what methods are provided for a given resource. One thing I want to highlight on the topic of methods is that you might find yourself making heavy use of Google Ads Service search stream and search functionality to retrieve objects of different types, instead of going through the REST resource specific to that object. Rather than calling search on the resource we want to fetch, we build a query string using the Google Ads query language and pass that query to the REST API through the customers.Google Ads Service resource endpoint. We'll see an example of this in a later video. In order to send a request to the API to employ one of these methods on a resource, we need to know the resource name, because that's going to be part of the URL of the REST interface, while providing a unique ID to the resource. Resource names mirror the hierarchical structure of the API. Since most resources are sub-resources of customer, most resource names start with customers. For example, the campaign resource starts with customers, then the ID of the customer within which the campaign exists, then campaigns, and finally the ID of the campaign. Now we can construct our REST URL, which is the endpoint where we will send our API request. The URL is comprised of 3 parts: the resource name and method, which we discussed, and the API version prefix. Using the same campaign resource example we just looked at, the resource name would be that hierarchical resource name, the method we'll use is mutate, and the API version prefix will be the standard Google Ads API endpoint with v9 as the specific API version for this example. When we put it all together, we get the full REST endpoint that we need to use in order to mutate this particular campaign on this particular customer. Note that we use a / to join the API version prefix and the resource name, and a colon to join the method to the end of the string. Quick reminder here that the Google Ads API makes heavy use of the REST notion of custom methods. For any given resource, the method we append might be specific to that particular resource, and different from what you would have seen while working with other REST APIs. Pulling all of this together, here's a full curl request using the REST API. We'll break down examples like the one shown here in future episodes, but here you can see how the authorization credentials, the URL, and the request data are pulled together into a full curl request using the REST API. One thing I'd like to highlight here is that the HTTP request method is POST, even though the method is search stream. The POST verb is used for most method types in the Google Ads API, which may be somewhat different from the other REST APIs you've used in the past. That just about covers everything I wanted to discuss as an introduction to working with REST in the Google Ads API. If you want to do a deeper dive into the design of the REST API, or the various resources and methods available to you, check out our REST interface guide and reference documentation. We've established a foundation of knowledge for working with REST in the Google Ads API, which I hope gives you the confidence and know-how to get started. Stay tuned for later episodes of the REST series, where we'll walk through examples of accessing the Google Ads API through REST. Thanks for watching.